Continuing with the nervous system, now that we have talked about the difference in the peripheral nervous system versus the central nervous system, and the difference in the autonomic nervous system being divided up into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now let's look at the actual breakdown of the spinal cord and the spinal nerves themselves. Okay, so the spinal cord is obviously part of the central nervous system. Spinal cord and the brain are part of the central nervous system. And of course, here's a cross section, and we can see the cross section that's made in the cervical area, the thoracic area, the lumbar area, and the sacral area. Okay, what we can actually see here is that, notice that all of these areas have a gray matter area in the middle. And of course, we said gray matter is basically where connections were being made, where we're actually making synapses. Okay, now notice that outside of the gray matter area, then we've got the rest of the spinal cord, which is the white matter. And notice that within the periphery of the spinal cord, which is surrounded by meningeal layers, notice that we have some distinct areas, no matter if we're looking at the sacral, lumbar, thoracic, or cervical area. And the first deep groove we see is called the anterior median fissure. Notice it's here, here, and here. And so anterior basically for us would be the same thing as ventral, or the belly side, or front side. Okay, now notice on the opposite side of that, we have a sulcus, a groove, more of a groove than a deep fissure, but nonetheless a noticeable groove here, 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 and here. And so it's called posterior median sulcus. So this line that we actually see running all the way down the middle of the spinal cord here is actually made up of the posterior median sulcus. Okay, now notice what else we've got. We have our central canal running in the middle of our, kind of, sometimes this is described, looks like a butterfly. So running in the middle of the butterfly of the gray matter is we actually see a hole, and that hole is called a central canal. Well, this is actually part of our ventricles that started in the medulla oblongata, and now we circulate cerebrospinal fluid all the way down through our spinal cord through this central canal. All right. So the next thing we really want to pay attention to here in a cross section is that we actually have a spinal nerve, which this is a spinal nerve. And looking here, notice that we have spinal nerves, thoracic nerves, lumbar nerves, sacral nerves, and a coccygeal nerve. Now, whereas we had 7 cervical vertebrae, we actually have 8 cervical nerves, because we have one that comes out before the C1 vertebrae. It comes out between the foramen magnum there in the occipital bone, and comes out between that and our C1 or atlas vertebrae. And then after that, then we have a vertebrae, then a nerve, a vertebrae, then a nerve, a vertebrae, then a nerve. And of course, the nerves come out in the intervertebral foramina, which are formed with 2 vertebrae overlapping each other. So we actually have 31 spinal nerves. So if you want to count these up, we have 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, so 8 and 12 is 20. We actually have 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, so 20 plus 5 is 30. And then we have this last nerve here, this coccygeal nerve, which makes it 31 nerves. And of course, these are paired nerves. All right, now notice that here in our not our vertebrae, but our spinal cord, we have some enlargement areas. We have a cervical enlargement. Notice that the periphery of that is a little bit larger in that area near the C6, C7. We also have a lumbar enlargement, and then notice that our spinal cord kind of starts becoming more thread-like as it gets further down. As a matter of fact, we call this area, we actually call it the cauda equina. And the cauda equina actually literally means equina being horse, cauda being tail. So it literally means horse's tail. So whoever named this said, well, this kind of reminds me of a horse's tail down through here. Notice it has a different appearance from the conus medullaris, basically where the inferior tip of the spinal cord is, down to the coccygeal ligament at the filum terminale. And that's where we anchor the spinal cord here near the coccygeal bone. Okay, so we have these 31 spinal nerves. We have 12 cranial nerves, which we will talk about later. And of course, these spinal nerves go out and innervate different parts of the body, and we'll talk about that. They actually form some overlapping areas called plexus, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes too. So what you need to be able to recognize now is the gray matter areas with their horns. These areas to the sides are called horns. The commissure is the area that joins the horns. You need to be able to recognize the central canals. You need to recognize also where the nerves actually originate and become these spinal nerves as they come off of the actual spinal cord. Now notice we have two areas here. We have a ventral root, because ventral means belly side, so it's on the same side as the anterior median fissure. So that means this is the ventral root here. And of course, these would have the same thing coming out here in the front side, but this is the only one that's showing it in the picture. We have a ventral root, and the interesting thing about that is actually receiving motor neurons. So motor neurons have their dendrites and cell bodies here in the gray matter, but the axons are going to move out through that ventral root and then eventually go into the spinal nerve. Now, the dorsal area, the back area, actually has this enlarged area called the dorsal root ganglion, and this is where sensory neurons are going to come in. We're going to have our nerve cell bodies here, and then they're going to actually go in and synapse into the gray area. So I've got sensory information coming in through the dorsal part. I've got motor information leaving through the anterior or ventral part. So I have a dorsal root and a ventral root. The dorsal root has the enlarged area called a dorsal root ganglion, and we actually see nerve cell bodies of the sensory neurons in that area. Okay. Now, again, looking at this, we see the things we were just talking about, the gray matter, we actually know this is the anterior portion. There's the body of the vertebrae. There's the spinous process and of the vertebrae, and here's the spinal nerve coming out right here. Here's the dorsal root ganglion, and then there's the ventral root. And of course, all of this is wrapped by our meningeal layer. Now, when we dissected the sheep brain, we saw the very thick meningeal layer, but what was mostly thick was this outer portion called the dura mater or dura mater. You'll hear it pronounced different ways. So this outer, very tough layer, dura mater, very protective, because the actual neural tissue itself is very delicate, needs a lot of protection. So this is the major protection right here. All right, then underneath that we have the arachnoid mater, and this kind of has a web-like attachment area, and this area has something called a subarachnoid space, and this is where cerebrospinal fluid happens to flow. So we've got cerebrospinal fluid flowing right down the middle of that little central canal. We also have cerebrospinal fluid flowing in this subarachnoid space next to the arachnoid mater. Then finally, we actually have our connective meningeal layer that lies right next to the neural tissue. It's very, very thin and delicate itself, but it's still protective over the neural tissue. And our very thin layer holding all this together is the pia mater. So the meninges, again, has the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the middle layer, and then the layer next to the actual neural tissue, the pia mater. Okay, again, we can see those three layers here. We can see the gray matter, the white matter, the ventral root, the dorsal root ganglion. We know that the ventral root is where motor neurons are coming out and the axons are traveling through there. The dorsal root is where sensory neurons are coming in, and the nerve cell body of the sensory neurons are in the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, again, another view of that whole criteria. Okay, now let's look at this just for a second, because just like the brain's very mapped out, the spinal cord is very mapped out. And I just want to show you a little bit of what that means. Again, notice I got the ventral root coming out, got the dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion going to the back side, the posterior side where the posterior median sulcus is. Got the anterior side here where the ventral root is coming out. Now, notice in the gray area, though, that we have what we call the horns of the gray area. So I've got the posterior gray horn, the side or lateral gray horn, the front or anterior gray horn. Also have a lateral white column, the white area out through here. I've got the posterior white column out through here, and have another lateral white column out through here. But what I want you to pay attention right now to are this information right here. Notice I've got the term somatic sensory, visceral sensory, and then visceral motor, somatic motor. So first of all, we know that there's a difference in sensory and motor. Sensory is receiving information that's telling us about something that's going on, so we can either get a reflex reaction from it or we send it up to the brain to interpret the information. And then motor is we're sending information out to go to either a muscle or a gland. Now, what does somatic or visceral mean? Well, somatic basically means it's either coming from something we are conscious of, like if that says somatic motor, that means it's going to skeletal muscle that we can consciously control or move. Whereas if that says visceral motor, then that means that that's originating our synapses here, but our information is running out. When I say our synapses here, it means we're receiving information to the dendrites or the nerve cell body of these neurons, but the axons are going to run out to a viscera or an organ in our body to cause it to do something by stimulating or relaxing the smooth muscle, because smooth muscle is usually what covers our viscera. So we're usually not as conscious about this. This we're very conscious of, and we control this. This is more autonomic. So if I'm receiving somatic sensory information, that's usually from something like a skin type sensation. It could possibly be something like what's called something from a muscle that lets me know how stretched or contracted the muscle is. But I'm usually fairly conscious of everything that's coming in through the sensory and the somatic. Now, the visceral sensory is things that are coming from my organs that are still sensory information that I'm sending back, but I'm not always conscious of the viscera and what's going on there. So we're conscious of part of what we're controlling. We're not necessarily conscious of everything that we're controlling, but nonetheless, we are still controlling it. Okay, this is a great example here of something called a reflex arc. And a reflex arc, in this case, notice again, here's my dorsal area, here's my ventral or anterior median fissure, and here's my ventral or front side. So notice that I've got my neurons here. There's the cell bodies and the dendrites. They're synapsing with something called an interneuron that's totally in the gray area. But this motor neuron is sending information to my muscles. Notice if I need to stimulate one thing, I probably also have to inhibit something else. Because if I'm going to pull my arm up, I'm going to use my bicep. So I need to not use my tricep in doing that. So when I send information to one, I probably have to send some information to inhibit or keep something else from prohibiting that movement. But what we see here is we see a situation where we touched something hot and the information went right back through this sensory neuron, and this would be a somatic situation. We were aware of it, and it went directly to this interneuron there. Now, this is our nerve cell body from the sensory neuron, so it would have been in that dorsal root ganglion that we've mentioned several times. So here's our dorsal root with the dorsal root ganglion. We're going to, once we get that stimulus, we're going to send the action potential back, release a neurotransmitter to an interneuron. Now, notice the interneuron's got several different connections. One of the things the interneuron's going to do is synapse with the stimulatory motor neuron, so we can actually stimulate the muscle to contract. The other thing that is happening here is we're going to inhibit the other muscles. Okay, that would oppose what this one's doing. But notice that it doesn't just stop there. We also have something that goes upward, and going upward means it's going up in the white part of the matter, because When we touch something